Two more
Okay.
very quick questions.
Yes.
One is, do you have a theory on, you can answer them in the order that you want to. Do you have a theory about where the virus originated, or are you a person who doesn't care? We're just dealing with what we're dealing with. And the other question is, what could the Biden administration do on day one? And how quickly could we feel the impact of that? Because the major problem has been there has been no central directive. But what could they do on day one that would make the biggest impact, in your opinion?
So you asked me two questions.
Yeah.
The first question was, where did the virus come from?
Yeah. And do you care?
So, I wrote a book that's coming out in a couple months called Preventable. And in it, it's basically like The Big Short for the pandemic. It's a kind of first-person narrative taking you through everything that happened in a sort of TikTok fashion. And in it, there's a character in this book who is a 34-year-old young woman who is, she's a fascinating personal story. She was victim of domestic abuse. She was homeless at part of her life. She was on Medicaid, and she receives a call. She's with her two daughters, kind of trying to hide away for COVID, asking her to come to the White House, because it turns out she's also a PhD economist and a PhD epidemiologist. So she goes to they call her an emergency to help her sort out these problems. So she shows up, and it's a bunch of like 30-year-old white boys with thin ties and roaming around the White House, all of whom are like super successful. And one day she gets invited to a meeting with President Trump, and for all the people who've come in to volunteer and to introduce themselves, and they all introduce themselves as these big captains of industry. And she comes to introduce herself, and she says her background, and she's got these two PhDs. And President Trump looks at her and says, "This thing was created in a lab in China, wasn't it?" And she's there, and she's in a room of 30 people. This is a scene from the book. And she looks around at everybody, and she knows that the chances of it being created in a lab in China are near zero. But she also knows contradicting the president in front of all these people is a delicate matter. So here's what she does. She says, "Mr. President, can I tell you a bedtime story?" And there's this kind of giant pause in the room, and he says, "Sure. Okay, tell me a bedtime story." So she says, "Well, there's this village in Africa. It's a beautiful jungle. And one day the villagers decide that they want to get to the other side without having to go through the jungle. So they bring in a bunch of people to pave a road through the jungle. So they knock down a bunch of trees, pave the road through the jungle. And while the workers are building this road, they eat bushmeat, which is basically live animals. And then they get through and they build the road. And then she stops, and he looks at her and he says, "Yeah." And she goes, "That's the story of how HIV started." And he says, "Really?" And she said, "Yes." So with the transfer of a virus from an animal to a human happens all the time. And every time we get closer to animals, and every time we destroy an animal's natural habitat, or global warming causes animals to migrate, more animals are in contact with one another, and weird things happen. And the passing of a virus, the reason they're happening more frequently, whether it's MERS or SARS or any of these things, is because nature is basically off kilter a little bit to some degree in terms of where animals and humans live and how we live. And so that's how these things happen, whether it's in a wet market or whether it's in camel meat in the Middle East or whether it's in Africa where AIDS began.
Was MERS from camel meat?
Yeah. Well, it was from the Middle East. I'm not sure it was camels exactly.
But it originated there as well.
It originated in the Middle East, yeah.
I could have listened to Andy talk all day. I really could have. I can in the bubble.